let's begin. Bulavinaka, good morning to our audience who's listening in from the Pacific and also from beyond the Pacific. Welcome to this session on loss and damage. I would like to acknowledge our esteemed panelists who joined me this morning, Dr. Viliamu Lese, Miyakami, and Salmonio. And I would also like to acknowledge the great and awesome team behind the scenes who's working tirelessly to make this event a smooth running one. So to set the scene, on loss and damage, climate extremes cause devastating impacts across the globe. These are impacts of slow onset processes such as sea level rise or rising temperatures and extreme events such as floods, hurricanes, and tropical cyclones. Loss and damage, which means climate impacts exceeding the adaptive capacity of countries, communities, and ecosystems, is already happening and has ramifications for many Pacific Island countries. This session will focus on the economic and the non-economic aspects of loss and damage and how the Pacific communities are dealing with everyday lived reality. So to introduce our first speaker, allow Dr. Viliamu Lese. Vili is a research fellow for climate change, food security, and disaster risk management, and just appointed as senior lecturer for DRR at the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development at the University of the South Pacific. Dr. Vili has conducted research and published widely in the field of risk resilience in agriculture, food security, climate change loss and damage, and evaluation of adaptations in Pacific Island countries. Excuse me. Vili is someone by birth, Tuvaluan by citizenship, and currently a resident of Fiji. I'd like to invite Dr. Vili to please provide his opening remarks to us this morning. Over to you, Dr. Vili. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Langi, can you hear me?
Can hear you perfectly well.
Thank you. So I will go ahead and speak right now about loss and damage in the Pacific. So thank you for the opportunity, and Bula Vinaka everyone, and Talo Falava. It's always a pleasure to join you all and talk about loss and damage. So thank you, moderator, and the organizers of this important meeting for the opportunity. I also want to acknowledge the great leadership from youth organizations and network in advancing the dialogue, interest, awareness, and actions to avert, minimize, and address the adverse impacts of climate change in our Pacific communities. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of our Pacific Island governments, regional and national organizations, partners, and also AOCs in pursuing and swimming strongly against the current to ensure our islands and people won't drown from climate change. So yeah, thank you very much. I think that is it's always good to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Viliamu, for that very brief opening remarks. I'd like to introduce next our second speaker, Miyakami. Miyakami is a Tongan singer, songwriter, and activist living in Fiji. She is passionate about indigenous sovereignty, decolonizing spaces, gender equality, and climate activism. She incorporates her passions into her music and uses her music as a platform to advocate for issues she feels are relevant to her Pacific brothers and sisters. With her music, she hopes to bring light to the issues affecting the Pacific in a way only music can. I'd like to invite Mia to say a few opening remarks to us this morning. Over to you, Mia.
Thank you, Langi, and thank you, Dr. Viliamu, as well. It's good to be sharing this space with you. I would like to apologize. Unfortunately, my camera is not being compatible with Hopin right now. This is my first time using it as well. But yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm very delighted to be here. I do think that it's a very important conversation that's very necessary to the realities of what we're facing today here in the Pacific with the impacts of climate change. And so I'm really looking forward to this talanoa and being able to share this space with both Dr. Viliamu and Solomon as well. So thank you.
I'd like to introduce our third speaker for this session, Solomon Iyo. Solomon Iyo is a graduate from the University of the South Pacific with a Bachelor of Arts in Law. He's a climate activist from the Solomon Islands. He's working alongside civil society and youth in the region to advance Pacific climate justice. Solomon was one of the 26 law students who founded the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change in 2019. He currently serves as the organization's campaign director. The PISFCC are currently campaigning for a UN General Assembly resolution on seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. I'd like to invite Solomon to the floor and to provide his opening remarks.
Good fala morning from Honiara. First of all, thank you very much, Moderator Langi, for hosting the session, and to our tech person today for Lole, and Gael, who is our translator, for facilitating this very important topic today. To many of us, some might say that I meet along Pacific Islanders in Solomon Islands. They're saying that when I talk about loss and damage, some are quite giving the confused face as well. But just to give a bit of a backstory on loss and damage, it's something that was spearheaded by Pacific Island countries all the way dating back in the 90s. So it's not a new topic, definitely for the Pacific Islands, and definitely should deserve more recognition and support by Pacific communities, the public, general public, and of course, a great commitment pushed by the governments and stakeholders, including us here today. So I'm very happy to be here alongside Mia, Dr. Viliamu, and you, Langi, and then the rest of you here today. I hope that we can be able to deliver you the right information and hopefully to stir the passion and necessary action we need to take especially towards COP26. Thank you, Tomas, and looking forward to this session.
Solomon. I'd like to now begin with some guiding questions for our panelists. And we know that loss and damage for many Pacific Islanders is a reality and something they're experiencing on a daily basis. Dr. Viliamu, I'd like to pose this question to you first. From your experience, having worked in this area and also on food security, how are the livelihoods of communities and individuals being impacted by the drastic impacts of climate change?
Thank you very much, Langi. Can you hear me? Wonderful. I think that is an excellent question. So thank you for that. Just before I answer that, I just want to re-emphasize again that climate change exacerbates and amplifies existing vulnerabilities. So I think that is very important to remember as we move along to answer this question. I also want to reframe, I think it's something we need to focus on, to reframe the language of impacts into the language of loss and damage. Because I think because we have been talking about impacts a lot, so it's more of a general way of speaking rather than going deeper into understanding how those impacts transform themselves into becoming losses or loss and damage at the local level. So specifically speaking about the impacts or the loss of livelihood, there are two elements here. One is the losses at the household level or losses at the localized level. And these are very, very specific. I'm not going to provide examples. I think I can do that during the discussion. But we have witnessed loss of home, loss of food, loss of income, loss of good water quality, loss of land, loss of education, loss of health, loss of culture, loss of identity, loss of mental health, loss of one's youth, because the time of the youth that they should spend in going to school and play and grow up and be a youth are now spent trying to address this global issue. So to myself, I think that is very important to consider. Loss of life, loss of heritage, loss of country, and loss of identity. I think this is also at the, like, very specifically at the household, and it can go up to the national level. But there are other systemic losses. Sometimes we forget this, that are happened, especially the loss to critical infrastructure, because the household livelihood also depend on critical infrastructure and services that support these livelihoods. For example, electricity, the roads, the airports, and these losses are related to the functionality of the community and also of the country as a whole, and that have domino effects that go down to impacts at the livelihood of the household level. So, for example, like a cyclone, there you blow away the house, loss of crops, and then loss of food and also income for the farmers. And at the same time, there is no electricity, and the road to the export market is not functioning. Markets are not functioning at the time. So sometimes we have to look at the direct impact or direct losses, but we also have to consider the cascading ones, especially the losses to the critical infrastructures and services at the national level. And it's the same thing with slow onsets. We see level rise. We have seen that the loss of land, high intensity of storm surges, loss of our sacred places, loss of our islands, countries, and we're looking at also the losses in the future. So group two important points I want to, the Pacific, I think, to bring to this dialogue. One is that the Pacific Island countries have been calling code red and declaring climate emergency and climate change as an existential threat for a very long time, as my brother Solomon mentioned earlier. So our leaders have declared climate change as existential threat. All of you youth groups, Climate Warriors, Climate Action Network 350, for example, have been calling this climate change a drastic and most severe issue globally. And existence of Pacific Island far before the UNFCCC and UN call it code red. Now I listen to the UN meeting, everybody is speaking code red, but this is what we have said many years before. Looking at the 1991, when I think before some of you were born, Vanuatu started a conversation on loss and damage, but it just included in the Paris Agreement. And loss and damage has been at snail pace for years, but credits to the hard work of our Pacific Island countries, organizations, AOCs, and many partners. As you can see, it becomes a code red when scientists say it is code red. But our Pacific Islands leadership and all of you listening have been experiencing code reds and feels all these impacts for a very long time. So it is also us Pacific Islands and you and youth that will continue to experience these losses into the future if we do not address the emergency right now. So there is a mismatch. A climate change emergency is not matched by the emergency type of action. So the second point is about the valuation of loss and damage. I think it's highly undervalued because the cost of like 1 billion Fijian dollars of cyclones, that is far less than the real loss and damage, because we're looking at the market value replacement cost, but we're not going to look into what they call a non-economic costing. And I think that is something very important for us to look at. And I think our partnership should look at research and capacity building to develop the methods, document the losses, and communicate them at every level. And we are cultural people. We are strongly tied to the land, the sea, and the sky. And any impacts on those elements impacts the inner core of our own existence. So those relationships and the connectedness of those relationships are far beyond the dollar sign. But it's something we really need to look at, documenting the impacts or the losses on livelihoods, communicate those losses to the right decision-making authorities, and use those information to make the right decision for our communities, our countries, and our existence. So thanks. Naka.
Thank you so much, Dr. Viliamu, for that incredible insight, and also on this call that you called on to reframe the language of impacts to one of loss and damage. So the Pacific has been that moral voice, and I would say the canary in the coal mine for many years now, calling on to the climate realities and the loss and damage that we are experiencing, and also that we are cushioning as a result of slow onset and also the rapid disasters. The other thing that you mentioned is the need for more research, and I guess this ties in on how can we also use our traditional wisdom and science to unearth and also to bring up some of the stories from communities and present this to the global wider community in terms of what the impact of loss and damage has had in the Pacific in terms of economic but also non-economic losses. I would like to now turn my attention to Mia Kami. Mia, you've worked as an activist and also as an artist. How is your work being influenced by the kind of loss and damage experiencing in the Pacific?
Thank you, Langi. I think that's a very good question too. I feel like what we experience here in the Pacific is just evidence. It's just further evidence of the fact that we really are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and the work that we do with 350. I feel that it definitely reflects the need for action and the urgency, because when I talk about like the experiences that we're seeing and what we're witnessing right now here in Fiji, but also for me, as I'm Tongan, so back home in Tonga, there's an inconsistency of seasons. For example, we are having longer winters, we're having hotter summers. Then you have the frequency and the severity of natural disasters that are taking place now. I mean, even just the recent example of Melbourne having a sudden earthquake that was super random. Then we had Winston, we had Kita back in Tonga, Cyclone Winston and Cyclone Kita. And I mean, I think just the fact that we're experiencing these now, and like I said, the severity and the frequency of these natural disasters are definitely a reflection of the gravity of the seriousness of the situation that we're in right now. And I mean, the fact that also our elders are saying that never in their living memory can they remember natural disasters being as bad as they are now. And I mean, the fact that our ocean temperatures are reaching to 30 degrees Celsius and we're getting to category 5 cyclones. And anyone that's been living in Fiji knows that in the past 5-6 years, we've just been experiencing cyclone after cyclone getting worse and worse, to a point where we now expect it to be a category 4 or 5. And so I just feel that with the work that we're trying to do at 350 Fiji is we're trying to recognize that the seriousness and the urgency that we need to work and to do the work is there. And but I think what's most important though is that we are trying our best to go back to the importance of community and understanding that at the end of the day, we as Pacific people, as people of the Pacific, we are meant to be custodians of our land and sea. As Dr. Viliamu mentioned, it's really important that we understand the connectedness of our relationships to our land, our oceans, our people. And so with the work that we do at 350, we try to make sure that whatever work we're doing, we're able to bring it back to the importance of community and understanding that relationship. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Mia, for highlighting that. You you've mentioned, you've talked on this, and also Dr. Viliamu has mentioned this word about connection. And I think that's a very deep meaning word for us Pacific Islanders, especially when we have deep connections with our land, with the sky, with the ocean, the rivers, and the trees. And I would now like to move on to Salmon. Salmon, when we consider our deep connections with the environment that we live in, especially as young people, and you work, with youth, you've been a champion for youth voices within this space. Um, do you think that there's enough work and efforts by the Pacific, but also when we look outside of the Pacific, the global community, in terms of addressing loss and damage?
Thank you, Langi, and Viliamu again, Nia, for your powerful interventions. I couldn't just agree more to that, but just to say that I appreciate your contribution to this discussion, as it really helps me really know that I'm not alone, and understand that this sentiment is being shared across by other Pacific Islanders as well. Before I begin my intervention today, I would like to pay my deepest respects to our Pacific pioneers. Of course, the late Tony de Broom, whose life commitment has truly sparked the flames of climate justice worldwide. The powerful and charismatic Anote Tong for his tireless climate advocacy and peering work on making putting to the table and to the limelight of migration with dignity. Of course, to my fellow panelists again, I'm really thankful for you both here today, and the organizers who are also fierce advocates for climate justice. And of course, to our countless of Pacific activists who are here today and who are not here today because they're, of course, fighting elsewhere in the region and across the world. You really have my utmost respect, admiration, and full-on support. Just to answer, before answering your question, Langi, I just would like to introduce you on how I got into the understanding loss and damage. My introduction to loss and damage was just in 2019, so that's fairly recent. I was traveling with my country delegation straight out of university to COP26 in Spain. It was really kind of like a baptism of fire, because I was assigned to follow the lead negotiator on loss and damage, prior to that, having to just crash course, learn and read through stacks of papers of loss and damage and trying to understand the really complex area of negotiation. But and sitting through the negotiation and seeing you have governments and the chief negotiators of the respective governments coming to the table, you're clearly seeing that there's a divide. Developed nations are still being very hesitant into making more commitments. And you have Pacific Island states, Caribbean states, and other developing countries really coming full force into the negotiation room as well. So what's one of the hopeful and I would say very practical things that I've learned that really stood out for me and from those negotiations, especially at COP25, really came at the end of the negotiations. This is where the parties have agreed to create the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage. The purpose to the uninitiated of this network, in the simplest way I can explain, is to really draw the connection to the reality of our Pacific Island countries, to the limited capacity of our governments to really scale up the volume on averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with this. Of course, we are seeing the adverse effects of climate change that's wreaking havoc across our communities in the Pacific. The SNLD, in its broadest sense, I think is trying to seek to fill the gaps by providing the technical support to developing countries' capacity to its responses to addressing loss and damage, which is even more critical, I would say, in the context as we are seeing in the case of climate-induced displacements across Pacific communities. But this is very important because let's think realistically and on practicality and addressing loss and damage for a second here. And how can one possibly claim support for loss and damage in this very black and white world that we're living in right now, if one doesn't have an assessment on a piece of paper that says for loss and damage of XYZ, this is the amount, and of this is the required sufficient support that needs to be met. So this becomes very it might sound very simple, but it does come with its own rocket science, especially in assessing what Dr. Viliamu and Mia has highlighted, non-economic loss, the loss that we cannot really quantify in pecuniary terms, or dollars and cash and all these things. That is not really important to be, in essence, to Pacific Island communities. But what is more important is that, as Professor Viliamu highlighted, the loss of a sacred sites. How can you possibly put a price tag on something that is worth even more than monies to Pacific Islanders? So this is where it becomes very complex in addressing loss and damage in terms of assessing the required responses that it needs to embrace. So definitely, this is where the SNLD come in. This network really can provide this technical assistance especially towards relevant organizations. You have bodies, you have networks out there that can assist the implementation of the relevant approaches to addressing loss and damage at local, national, and regional, and even the international stages as well. As we all know, as I've mentioned, developing countries are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, and therefore would need more of these assessments. The assistance of, hopefully we can see from this network, can really help lead to the capacity independence. Of course, as I mentioned, we're limited in capacity, but this is where through that assistance, we can be able to build local capacity for our self-sufficiency on addressing loss and damage, because climate change is here to stay for a very long time. We really need to start investing through our Pacific people so that we have the sufficient capacity to address the impacts on our own. This is also, the network will provide a very great opportunity for facilitating cooperation and learning and sharing of knowledge and information across countries from all across the world, countries in developing countries, vice versa to countries in developed nations as well. It's a geopolitical issue and definitely would require a lot of information sharing and collaboration. I'm sure that I did not do justice to the benefits and relevance of this network here. And as you should know, that there's more of the benefits that this network would provide. But just coming to answer the question of Langi here, I think as Dr. Viliamu has highlighted, there's a lot of investment, a lot of work has been done in addressing climate change. We cannot be complacent on that, but there's still a mountain to climb in terms of addressing climate change in the broader sense, and more in particularly loss and damage as well. But for now, I would really like to share with you all some recommendations. I think that negotiators and stakeholders can web into their advocacy, especially when they're traveling towards COP. We really need that technical assistance in the Pacific Islands, and this network really provides for it. However, at COP25, the parties, although set up this network, they have not really fleshed out the process to which the operationalize this network to include of its modalities and its capacity to take on work forward. So it has not been yet implemented. So really, I am here as a youth. I'm calling for the parties, especially to our negotiators as well, who are going to resolve and give effect to this effect of this operation of this network. So we, the Pacific, can better build a resilience in addressing climate change, especially in the field of loss and damage for ourselves as well. Furthermore, I think we need to start looking at raising a lot of awareness, especially a general public, as I've mentioned in my introduction here, that some people might not really detach from this field of area of addressing climate change. So this is one particular area that relevant organizations, especially civil society, can really foster that public education and awareness raisings in the efforts to address this on all levels. It's also, there's more recommendation, but if I could add on another one, is just really, we need new finances, resources allocated for loss and damage. At this point, there's not a significant amount of money that has been invested in loss and damage. So I hope that it was COP, the board of, especially the board of the Green Climate fund could definitely continue to provide more financial resources for this. And it must, and through these financial resources, we must guarantee that they are not, they can be more accessible than they are right now, and not in the form of loans or insurance, but definitely in the forms of grants. And this will, of course, the next session is on climate finance. I strongly think that those panelists there would definitely highlight this as well, of this importance and these barriers. I'd just like to conclude that I really am happy here today, truly, from the bottom of my heart, to stand together with the Pacific Collective Resistance and emphasize that our communities have lost and will lose a lot by the day as we speak. A few days ago, I met one of our auntie, and she's a woman. She mentioned that women from the coastal areas, coastal community of YCC, that's a community in South Malaita province in Solomon Islands, just struggling to just do the basic cooking for their families because their kitchen fireplace is completely indunated by the tide as it rises. It's not really hard to believe her because I've just been there 2 months ago, and I kid you not, I really have to rub my eyes to comprehend where the normal watermark line is, and then where the watermark line is when the sea level rise. It's truly scary to see that. I had to just sleep, go to the next day and test that theory again and see if that level, if water rise to that level, and it does. Really is, I've seen these experiences. It really helps me. I know we're all frustrated by it, but I think I encourage you all as Pacific Islanders to channel this experience to motivate you and those around you to really scale up their efforts in helping our communities on the ground and really taking the necessary step to fight for this, to fight in the country that we're heading towards, that is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution that fired up the machinery of this unequitable and sustainable economic model and mechanisms that continue to perpetuate the climate catastrophe to this day. I just conclude here I echo the calls and concerns of my fellow Pacific panelists and Pacific Islanders who are truly the living experts of the climate crisis. And I can live to say that the threat of climate change to the Pacific is truly existential. Every fraction of the warming is really catastrophic. And every millimeter of the sea level rise, there will be thousands more kitchen fires that will be put out. For on that note, big falatagi tumas for your kind attention.
Solomon, for highlighting that you've touched upon, the Santiago network on loss and damage, how that came about, and the need to operationalize that particular network and why it's critical for the Pacific to support that. And you've called also on increased awareness and finally on commitments to finance loss and damage, which is also, as I understand, is a priority for Pacific Island delegations. I'd like to now go, move back to Mia and then Dr. Viliamu, and if you can provide your responses in terms of what is your message to COP26 presidency when we talk about loss and damage from a Pacific perspective, and what is it that you'd like to see as concrete actions coming out of COP26. So Mia, if you'd be able to respond to that, and then Dr. Viliamu.
Thank you, Langi. And thank you, Solomon, for your message and your points. I completely agree as well. And it's nice to see the action that's already being taken by the youth and other NGOs and other groups. And in terms of your question, Langi, I think the message that I would give when we talk about loss and damage from a Pacific perspective is, like I said before, we've said it, and what Dr. Viliamu has said as well, is we've said it time and time again. We are on the front lines, and we don't have the time for the same kind of just constant only discussion and only deliberation and then we're just stuck in the same spot that we've always been in, because we're already suffering the loss, we're already suffering the damages, and people's homes and livelihoods are suffering. And so we don't have a lot of the time that we did before when we were talking about before climate change was this big part of our lives, we were just talking about, if we keep polluting the planet, climate change is going to happen. If we keep polluting our oceans, climate change is going to happen. Like, we're not at the it's going to happen point anymore. Like, we're in it. And so it's no longer just an environmental issue. It's a humanitarian issue now, because like we have been talking about, it's no longer just about these issues that we can quantify, that we can put money on. It's people's livelihoods are at stake, people's homes are being lost. And just an example, back home in Tonga, my auntie would tell my mom about how on our home island, the coastal villages are witnessing the sea level rise, and it's affecting their homes, and they can't live there anymore. It's affecting their crops. It's affecting their availability and access to resources. And so if you've been to Tonga, we're not a mountainous country. There's nowhere for people to flee if the water continues to rise. And we're not the only island that's like that. And so I just think that right now, since there is currently no international mechanism that provides the support for countries like ours to recover from loss and damages that is climate induced, I just feel that the issue with this conversation, and the message that I like to put forward, the issue with this conversation is that we are still giving too much power to countries that are realistically the largest contributors to the losses and the damages that we are experiencing now. And I mean, the fact that this is not a new conversation, and that there has been discussions before on addressing loss and damages, where developing countries are demanded to enhance and strengthen their part and their contribution to our loss and damage. I think that is just a reflection on the urgency and the need to address the fact that in the end, we don't have the time to wait for other countries, because the reality for us is happening now, and the severity of it is huge. And so, yeah, we shouldn't have to wait for countries to agree when we are really on the front lines experiencing the worst of it firsthand. And it's not just economic, and it's not just environmental. People's lives are at stake now, and our future is at stake, and the future of our heritage, our culture, our connection to land, to place, to ocean, to people is all at stake. And so I just feel that that would be what I would put forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Mia, for your messages, which has been noted, and will definitely be, form a key part of the summary of the outcomes from this particular event, as well as the contributions from our friend Salman from the Solomon Islands. I'd like now to ask Dr. Viliamu if you'd like to also share what is that, one key message to the COP26 presidency from a Pacific perspective in the context of loss and damage, and what is one concrete outcome or action that you'd like to see coming out of COP26?
Well, thank you very much, Langi. I feel really inspired and empowered sitting here, very refreshed, and feel youthful listening to Solomon and also Mia and yourself, moderator. I think this is very good, and this is the value of panel discussions like this and Talanoa like this. It's not just to prepare for the COP26. It's not just to prepare for the COP. It's also about sharing what is most valuable to us, exchanges to prepare for what's coming up next and beyond. I think that is very important to hear. So thanks to the panelists. And I wholeheartedly agree as well with what have been shared. The message I have one and a half. I have one message to the COP, and I have one message to the people of the Pacific, especially youth. The message to the COP is match the climate emergency language with climate emergency action and commitment, not just words. I think that is very important for us. You don't call the fire truck and the fire department and say, my house is on fire, it's an emergency. And then the fire truck said, we will attend to that 24 years later. And then when they come, they forgot to fill the water inside the fire trucks. So they will just stand there and say, it's an emergency, it's an emergency. but nothing is done. Let the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement grow some teeth and help create financial resources, applications to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We have been talking about loss and damage for years, as mentioned. It is time to put real actions there and stop talking about politics and all these things. It is a human right, human security, justice, and also an existential threat to our reality in the Pacific. For the Pacific, I would say going forth to our Pacific network, get a seat at the table. Get inside there where the decision makings are done, where the processes are happening. Be a part of the negotiation. If the seat is not available, create one. Make one seat for the Pacific, for the youth. The COP is like the final stage of a long process, a year-long or 2 years long process or 3-year-long process, and so forth. So there are lots of meetings, sub-meetings where our Pacific voices can be heard. And I think so we really need the youth and everybody to take a seat, find a seat, get a seat at the table. And I think the other message for us is to sort out our internal houses in the Pacific. We need to know in the Pacific who's doing what, where the information is, who's doing the research, who is doing capacity building on this. We sort of know, but we're still competing against each other. We need to work together in our canoe. We should unite the members of our group to talk about the late Honorable De Bloom when he was talking about the story of the canoe. The 3 people in the canoe. The only way that canoe can sail forth is when 3 of them work together. But they all have different responsibilities on the canoe. So when one slack off, the canoe is not moving to the right direction. So what I'm saying here, we know our weaknesses in the Pacific. How could we build our strength out of that? And I think this is very important because I remember President Biden, he was saying we should not just focus on demonstrating the examples of our strength, but we should showcase the strength and power of our examples. And I think this is we should provide a strong evidence to the COP, to any discussion or any table we attend or any meeting we attend. And just before I finish this, just to briefly mention, I'm very proud of you all because you are products of the University of South Pacific. And I think the University of South Pacific has built what we call the climate champions, and you all there. So I'm very proud of that. But to add a little bit, the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development in the University of South Pacific, we do have a very strong climate change program. And now we will start from next year, the postgraduate in Pacific Island and Ocean Stewardship. So, and then we have master's and PhD programs that are actually doing research to generate the understanding, generate the evidence on the effectiveness of adaptation, how much we have lost, and all these things. And I think it's very important to mention that. So if you need to know more, we have Salote and Asalo, who's part of the youth group to contact. We also have Pacific TAFE, climate change, certificate level 4 in resilience. People can do. We also research-led, student-led research. That is very important to commit to in every different field, and the research partnership with a lot of organizations. I think in the Pacific Islands, we developed methods with the UNESCO in order to document loss and damage in 5 countries. And it was launched during the COP Fiji led. And I think that is very important for us. But to say it at the end, we really need the community's involvement. We need our very people to be involved in research, in capacity building, and communication of the outcome of this research. Communication to themselves, who are the leaders of the communities, who are also leaders in the political space. And they are the ones who are representing our Pacific in the COPs as well. So we need investments on capacity building, research on loss and damage in order to inform actions. So yeah, that's my message to the COP presidency, and I think especially to us. We continue to work together to paddle our canoe. Vinaka, thank you.
Vinaka Vakalevu, Dr. Viliamu, I'm just so inspired by all your contributions this morning, and you've highlighted some of the key points about climate emergency language not being matched by the climate emergency action. I love your analogy about the fire truck and the fact that they still not they are there, but they haven't still put out the fire. And you've also highlighted Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, which speaks to loss and damage, and the fact that it should grow some teeth. And I'm also aware that there are efforts that are pushing our own Pacific Island countries and other vulnerable countries to reject Article 51 of reject Article 51 of the Paris Agreement, which states that Article 8 on loss and damage does not involve or provide any basis for liability or compensation. The Pacific is clear that the Pacific people are demanding that the polluters must pay for the loss and damage. And then you also touch on a very key point on sorting out our own internal housing here in the Pacific, and trying to understand who is doing what, who is doing the research, who is doing the capacity building, and so forth. And again, you use the analogy of the canoe and the three people in the canoe to bring the Pacific people together, not only governments, but also civil society, development partners, indigenous people, youth, women and girls, people with disabilities, LGBTQI, and so forth, to be part of this conversation on loss and damage. And again, he reiterated the need for research on loss and damage to inform action, and the need for capacity building. With that, I know that we are running quickly out of time, and so I thank the panelists again for your valuable contributions to this discussion, and I would like to invite our participants and audience, if you have any questions, please use the chat. Sorry, not the chat box. You can use the chat box, or you can use the Q&A tab to pop your question. Just a few things that also I'd just like to share is that the world needs to hear the voices from the Pacific Islands who are often portrayed as victims of the climate crisis, but not commonly acknowledged as global thought leaders in transforming unjust system for climate resilient futures. And this is something that you've all touched on. Solomon and Dr. Viliamu, as well as Mia, we talked about COP26. COP26 will be the litmus test for many developing countries who are experiencing devastating climate loss and damage, most commonly amongst the most poorest and the most vulnerable. So the question of finance for loss and damage, as well as the willingness of the international community to operationalize the Santiago Network on loss and damage, will determine the extent to which the international climate regime is sufficient to address mounting climate injustices being suffered by those on the front lines of the climate catastrophe. The final thing I also wanted to share with the issue of loss and damage, for instance, is therefore critical at COP26, because if there aren't any real outcomes on this agenda item, then the message from us to the world is to expect more climate litigation outside of the UNFCCC processes. And I know Solomon and the youth from Pacific Island Students Fighting for Climate Change have been working tirelessly to advance the call to support, to seek an advisory opinion from the UN General Assembly, sorry, not the UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice on the obligation of states with respect to human rights and climate change. So with that, let me just have a look at the question and answer tab. There isn't any, but I see comments coming in from a Naomi Nawasaitonga, inspiring sentiments by Dr. Lese. The Pacific Island countries need to work together, not in silos. The fact that the hardest hit of the effects of climate change are the Pacific Island countries must move us collectively. We have 3 minutes left, so I'll give 1 minute each to each speaker to provide any final remarks or comments. I'd like to invite Mia, and then Solomon, and then Dr. Viliamu.
Thank you, Langi. Thank you, everyone. I do believe that this conversation is very important, and it is unfortunate that we're running out of time, because I know that this is definitely one that we all could have gone on for a lot longer. But I think what has been said so far has definitely carried the weight of the importance of this conversation. And I do want to just reiterate what Dr. Viliamu had said, the importance of making sure that we as Pacific people are present at the table at the decision-making level, because like I'd mentioned, we are on the front lines and we are experiencing the effects of climate change now. And so, yeah, I just want to thank Langi for moderating. Thank you to the team that's organizing this, and to our interpreters, and to the panelists. Finally, it's been a joy being here in this space, and I look forward to seeing you all continue to flourish in the work that you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mia. Solomon?
Thank you, Mia. That was really beautifully said as well. Just very quickly, I think if you are a fan of the Marvel heroes, I think your priorities need to change now, because the people that you should be adoring on a superhero level, sorry, is those negotiators, your negotiator from your respective countries. They're going into COP to commit long hours, long periods. They're sitting in negotiating table, putting the communities and people of the Pacific in their minds, and trying to ensure that the rest of the world gets in the canoe, as the analogy by Dr. Viliamu, gets in the Pacific canoe and then paddle towards the right direction. So this is one thing that I really encourage we really need to support and provide that continuous priorities and guidance towards our negotiators who will be going in hard in the negotiation at COP26. It's also very important that they go in person, because COP is not like, we cannot do it over Zoom. It's something that you really need in the negotiating room. You have to be there. And as someone raised it, I think it was Damani, he said, put a face and a voice to the people who are suffering the most. Negotiators are just Pacific Islanders. There will be the face and the voice of the Pacific who will be advocating for the current generation, the future generation, and they're the ones who will be making the right catalyzing to get us through in getting a favorable outcome in this COP this year. So on that note, I really want to appreciate the audience who are joining here. Langi again for the excellent moderation, the tech team, the interpreter, and our fellow panelists. I'm very happy that we had this discussion. And as Mia said, we really need to prolong this conversation, but sadly it has come to an end. Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you, Solomon. And over to Dr. Viliamu.
Thank you very much, Langi. I also agree strongly with Solomon and Mia, Vinaka, for that. Three words to end this from my side. One is voice, and I think I want to share what Tahoro, my brother Tahoro Kami, told me 21 years ago. He says, Vili, if you don't speak up, who will speak up on behalf of the fish, the mangroves, the forest, the roads, the houses? So be the voice, not just a voice for the people, but the voice for our environment, the voice for our ocean. So when you go to the COP or you're involved in these COP processes, remember that the loss and damage is not just about the losses to the people. It's also about the losses or the loss of our environment and our very important cultures. The second one is systemic. The second word is systemic. That while we are thinking of loss and damage, try to remember the systemic components of building resilience. Climate change exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. It's adding on health risk, environmental risk, even the safety and protection, gender, inclusivity issues, corruptions, and all of the other things. So we need to address climate change as well as a lot of these development issues. And the third one is connectedness. We always remember to connect ourselves, be the voice of the connection between human and the environment, our Pacific Island people, not just the connection to the environment, but the connection to each other. We need to work together. How we connect people within the country and the people between the countries. So we have one collective, powerful voice focusing on the systemic of our environment, the people living in harmony with nature, now, forevermore. Thank you very much. Vinaka.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Viliamu. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the incredible speakers who've joined us this morning. Thank you for your insightful contributions and valuable contributions to this discussion. We're now going to wrap up. I'd like to thank the tech support, the team behind the scenes, our lovely audience, as well as our interpretation team behind the scenes. So from here in Fiji, Vinaka Levu, and hope to see you again throughout the sessions today. Vinaka.
Nakalangi, Vinaka interpreters, Naka follow and organizers. Yo maropito Mia, and thank you so much, Solomon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Viliamu and Mia.
Hello.
Naka, and all the best. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Hello.